tried to delay the inevitable, and he tried to push us back to starting at 6:09. But little does he know, I can go 6:09 to 7:09 just as easy as I can go 6 to 7.
Have at it.
So there we go. For those of you who are watching from a distance, my phone said it was 104 degrees outside, which in American temperature means you can put yourself some water out, go to church, and by the time you come back, it'll be boiling.
My thermometer on my porch when I came over here said 112.
112. Somewhere between 104 and 112 is what the temperature is. All right. Well, we're gonna pray real quick, and then we're gonna jump right in. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for just bringing us all here together tonight. Just help us to focus in on you and put every distraction aside. We love you, and we ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I was thinking about this. I'm like, why don't I remember much about what we talked about last time? And then it dawned on me, it's been like 3 weeks since I've actually done chapter 1 of Habakkuk. So, what did we actually talk about last time?
You didn't answer those questions when I asked you about Hebrews.
Well, yours was longer than 3 weeks, okay? I taught for like 5 weeks in a row there for a while.
Why don't you tell us?
Okay, well, does anyone remember even just like a general date for when we were dating Habakkuk? So we at least know what century we're dealing with.
I didn't bring my paper. I wrote it down, but I didn't bring my paper.
600 something.
About 6
Yes.
on.
Yes. We gave a rough date between 609 and 605 BC during the reign of King Jehoiakim. So Habakkuk asks a couple questions in the first chapter, but we'll start with the first one. What's kind of like the first question he asks? All you have to do is just look back at chapter 1.
Chapter 1?
Yes. It's like the second verse.
Know how long?
How long?
How long will I have to wait?
Right.
Probably.
I kind of was making fun of Habakkuk. I called it baby's first theological question. But yeah, basically, right, why does God allow wickedness to go unchecked? That was sort of his first question. So we established who the wicked were, right? In verse 4, it says, the wicked surround the righteous. So who did we say that the wicked were?
The Ninevites?
No, that was, what book was that? That was Nahum, right? Yeah.
So it would be...
All of these minor
Judah.
prophets, they just wrote together. Yes, Judah! Yes. Yes. So we established that the wicked is Judah, or was Judah, I guess. And we said that it was wicked at an institutional level, right? This is during the reign of King Jehoiakim. We know from history and from the Bible, not a very good king, right? Very evil, very wicked. The priesthood at this time was also very corrupt as well. And so this was sort of wickedness at an institutional level, which trickled down into the common folk, making their lives pretty miserable. In verse 4 of chapter 1, we have a description of Judah. There is no justice. They are wicked. They have perverse judgment. And then in verse 7, we have a description of Babylon, which is very similar. Terrible, dreadful, and judgment proceeds from themselves. So we see that Judah is not that much more holy than Babylon, despite them sometimes thinking that they are. And we pointed this out, and this will also come into play, in this chapter. God is giving Judah what it wants, right? Judah wants to do things their own way, live by their own rules, have their own form of justice. And God is going to give them what they want. And so they're going to have to live under Babylonian rule, which doesn't follow God and has its own wicked form of justice. And then the second question that Habakkuk asked, which we did not get around to answering, but we will get around to answering this time, is what? I know that one of you, you're just dying to say it.
Is that in verse 4?
Verse 12-ish.
Ish. Well, he's kind of in the form of a question asking, aren't you from everlasting? Aren't you eternal? Are you from everlasting to everlasting? He asked that question in that verse.
Yeah, so like the first question he asked is he asked, why do you allow wickedness to go unpunished? And what was God's answer? He answered, I don't, right? Do what?
He's gonna punish it.
He's going to punish it, right? And then how is he going to punish it, right? How is he going to punish the wickedness of Judah?
Captivity.
Yes, but like think just like broader. I mean, yes, but like
But there's more to it.
with the wickedness of Judah. I mean, with the wickedness of Babylon. He's going to punish the wickedness of Judah with the wickedness of Babylon, part of which is captivity. So yes, you're right. And so then Habakkuk's second question is, how could God use the wickedness of one nation to punish the wickedness of another nation? And so this is like baby's second theological question, I guess. And so we never actually got an answer. The chapter just kind of like abruptly ended with Habakkuk kind of whining. And so we get into chapter 2, and Habakkuk's hard. There's not really like a great way to split up these chapters, so I just kind of arbitrarily drew up lines. So we're going to read the first 8 verses of chapter 2. Starting in verse 1, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart, and watch to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer when I am corrected. Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith. Indeed, because he transgresses by wine, he is a proud man, and he does not stay at home, because he enlarges his desires as hell, and he is like death, and cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations, and heaps up for himself all peoples. Will not all these take up a proverb against him, and a taunting riddle against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his? How long? And to him who loads himself with many pledges. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Will they not awaken who oppress you? And you will become their booty. Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you, because of men's blood, all and the violence of the land and the city, and of all who dwell in it. Okay, that's the first 8 verses. So yeah, that's sort of a lot to take in. So we're gonna try to break this down. What's interesting about the end of verse 1, right? I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I'm corrected. So, yes, I am aware that not every translation translate this the exact same way, but play along with me in my game and pretend like your translation also translates it the same as mine. What's interesting about what Habakkuk says here?
About verse 1.
Yes.
Well, that verse 1 is God's answer, correct?
Well, this is Habakkuk talking in verse 1. And then verse 2, it says, then the Lord answered me and said.
Okay.
Well, he's been doing all this whining, and now he's gonna stand and watch.
He's going to stand and watch, yes. But look at the very end of verse 1, right? And again, this, I understand not every translation translate this the same way.
Well, mine says, "And what answer I am to give to this complaint?"
Ah, so yes, you have the other translation. So yes, the way mine translates it and the way some translate it is what I will answer when I am corrected. So I think that this is interesting, right? And I will talk in a minute. I'll talk about the implications of translating this the other way. But assuming that this is the correct translation, Habakkuk expects to be corrected by God, which is interesting. He's sort of like bracing for the impact. He writes that he will see what God will say and what he will answer when he's corrected, right? So already sort of like knows in the back of his mind, maybe he shouldn't be asking God all these questions, or at least maybe not asking them in the way that he is. And we talked about in the last chapter, it's not always sinful to question God, but there is a fine line, right? And definitely no one should just go and try to find that line and try to just walk it as close as possible between like blasphemy and questioning God. Don't try to find that line. But to whatever extent Habakkuk's questioning was sinful, we don't really know. But we do know that he thought he had overstepped a line and he was sort of expecting to be corrected and most likely expecting to be put in his place. Now, like I said, some translations translate this as complaint, and it would read either as how Habakkuk would respond to his own complaint or how God would respond to Habakkuk's complaint, which I think is what the NIV goes with. But many scholars do believe that an interpretive option for this is correction or reproof. But however, the two interpretations aren't necessarily mutually exclusive either. And one commentator writes how it can be sort of both at the same time. He says Habakkuk may have been patiently, meekly waiting for God's answer to his complaint, and he may have been, or he may have been fully aware that his words merited divine reproof. He was fully expecting God to censure him for his attitude, right? So the whole point of this, the whole point of that is it's all to say, at the end of the day, even if your translation doesn't read the exact same as mine, it's not like mutually exclusive. You have to choose one or the other. But I do think it's interesting that if we're assuming that this is to be translated as like correction or reproof, Habakkuk seems to know that he's sort of overstepped a line with God and he's sort of bracing for the impact. And we will sort of see God almost correcting Habakkuk, or almost sort of like, putting Habakkuk in his place later as we go on. So, anyway, anything else? Anyone want to add anything to that?
Well, but I read you that complaint. It also says in a footnote, "or what to answer when I am rebuked."
There you go, yeah. The Hebrew word can mean either. So we don't entirely know, but either way, we will see that God does sort of put Habakkuk in its place, which is interesting. So we jump down to verses 7 and 8. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Will they not awaken who oppress you? And you will become their booty, because you have plundered many nations. All the remnants of the people shall plunder you, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and the city, and of all who dwell in it. So, look at these verses and sort of describe the irony of this situation, and then also describe how this relates back to chapter 1 and to Habakkuk's question. I guess this would be his second question. All right, so I guess we'll just do it one at a time, right? What's sort of the irony of this, what's being described here?
Judah's been doing the same thing that Babylon was doing. They were
Or the
plundering.
Ninevites.
Do it.
The Ninevites or Babylon.
Well, Nineveh's already been destroyed at this time. So Nineveh was destroyed in, 605? Or no. 612. Nineveh was destroyed. And we give this a rough date of 609 to 605 BC. So Nineveh's destroyed, and by this point, the Assyrian Empire is destroyed also. So,
Babylon.
yes, it is talking about Babylon. What were you saying?
That Judah is being punished for doing the same things that Babylon did.
Well, this isn't talking about Judah here, right?
Okay.
This is talking about Babylon. So, very simply put, if you take away nothing from this summer and all of the minor prophet lessons which we've done, remember this: God is flipping the tables, right? What goes around comes around, kind of a thing. So, Babylon is sort of extorting these nations, and then these nations are going to extort Babylon. So some scholars actually think that chapter 2 was written or occurs after chapter 1, like quite a bit of time after chapter 1, because it makes it seem like Babylon is now a very active oppressor of nations, as opposed to just sort of a looming threat in the background like we get from chapter 1. In any case, whether this is currently happening at the time of writing, like Babylon is currently very oppressive, or at the time of writing, this is like a future event, Babylon will oppress all these nations. In any case, Babylon is given a woe, right? So what is the woe? Where
Verse
is...
6.
Yes, verse 6, thank you. Woe to him who increases what is not his. Right, so they're given a woe for taking what is not theirs. And one day, the remnant of these nations will take what is not theirs from Babylon, right? So God's turning the tables, right? And so sort of like the technical term for what Babylon is doing is extortion. And some translations even have the word extortion in there. I think the NIV, being one of them, actually uses the word extortion. So Babylon was keeping these pledges. Now, what does this mean, right? Do we have any like great historical buffs in here that knows what this is actually talking about? Right. So you want to go take out a loan. What's something the bank might ask you? Yeah. Verse 7.
What was the question again?
Well, the question I just asked was like, you go to the bank, what's something they might ask you? Do you go to the bank to get a loan? What's something they might ask you for? Collateral, right? So these pledges, right? And this is from the end of verse 6. To him who loads himself with many pledges. These pledges, this was like an ancient system of collateral, right? You would pledge something, okay, well, I'll get 50, whatever the currency was back then, and I'll give you my cloak, right? And it was usually something insignificant because the people who did this were incredibly poor and they didn't have anything really of value to give. So, okay, I'll give you my cloak or something if you give me some money. And what Babylon was doing is they were using these pledges or this collateral as sort of leverage to make people pay more than what they actually owed. Either that or they were just committing theft and they were just keeping these pledges all together. In either case, they were committing some sort of like white-collar crime, basically. And Babylon's punishment for all of this is very fitting, because one day the people that Babylon owes money, verse 7 says, will rise up to collect. So it's not just that people owe Babylon money, but Babylon owes other people money, and they're going to rise up to collect one day, verse 7. And then in verse 8 it says that all the remnants of the people will plunder Babylon. So all these nations which have been oppressed will want a piece of the pie when Babylon falls. Babylon fell in 539 to the I really should have looked up how to pronounce this. Achaemenid Empire? Sure, why not? Persian Empire, basically, for lack of a better term. And it was under their rule, right? So they didn't just like completely go in there and just like wipe them all out, genocide them. They sort of incorporated them into their empire. And so all of these sweet tax dollars for Babylon were now going to this foreign nation. So again, sort of what goes around comes around sort of a thing. Now then, our second question which we asked was, how does this relate back to chapter 1 and to Habakkuk's question, right? So Habakkuk asked, his second question was, how can God use the evil of one nation to punish the evil of another nation? And so now we see verses 6, 7, and 8. So how does this relate back to that question? Or how does this sort of answer this question?
Giving back to them what happened in the first place, kind of like we said a while ago, payback.
Yes, you're talking about for Babylon, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, so, Habakkuk sees the problem with Judah. He says, why do you let this go unpunished? God says, I don't. I will use the wickedness of Babylon to punish the wickedness of Judah. Then what does Habakkuk do? He says, how can you use the wickedness of Babylon to punish the wickedness of Judah? And what does God says? I'll use the wickedness of another nation to punish the wickedness of Babylon, who punishes the wickedness of Judah. So it's just sort of this never-ending cycle of using wicked nations to punish wicked nations.
Sovereignty of God.
Exactly. That's what this is all about. You 100% correct. God gives sort of a non-answer, right, to Habakkuk's question. God does not justify his actions to Habakkuk, nor does he need to justify his actions to Habakkuk. He simply allows Habakkuk to see into the way that history works. Like we said, sort of like this never-ending chain of divine judgment. God uses wickedness to punish wickedness, and the cycle seems to go on and on and on. So at the end of the day, wickedness never goes unpunished. It's not a matter of, how can you sit by and do nothing, God, never punishing the wicked. No, God is punishing the wicked. He's not ignoring wickedness, and he's even using the evil in this world to bring about his greater purpose. And this is a very special thing that Habakkuk is allowed to see. Not every person is allowed to see into this, okay, I'm going to kind of show you how the world works. I'm going to kind of show you how I dispense judgment and justice, right? This is God, how God dispenses judgment and justice. Not every person is allowed to see this, and not even every prophet is allowed to see this. So this is a very special thing that Habakkuk is allowed to see. And this is, not something that everyone gets to see, and certainly not every prophet gets to see. So anyway, how is Habakkuk corrected by God, right? So we talked about how Habakkuk was sort of bracing for the impact, sort of expecting to be corrected by God. How is he corrected by God here in these verses?
Which verses?
Well, just the first 8 verses, right? This is just sort of looking back at what we've read so far. So God's answer to Habakkuk's complaint was also a bit of a rebuke. So,
I'm looking at verse 4.
well, that's not exactly where I'm going. So, God is essentially answering Habakkuk's question with Habakkuk's question itself, if that makes any sense. So Habakkuk asks, how can you use the wickedness of Babylon to punish Judah? And God answers by saying, he will use the wickedness of another nation to punish Babylon. So he's sort of answering Habakkuk's question with Habakkuk's question. How can you do this? Well, I just do it again. I just do it a second time, essentially is what God is saying. So just as Babylon extorted money, so too will these other nations.
Station myself up.
Bill's speaking in tongues over here. All right. The floor is yours, Bill. Just as Babylon extorted money from these other nations, so too will these other nations extort money from Babylon. And God sort of puts Habakkuk in his place, right? God does not really answer Habakkuk's question. He doesn't because what Habakkuk is really asking is, why? Why does God do what he does? And God answers, he just simply shows Habakkuk that he is also punishing Babylon. Habakkuk never really gets this question never gets an answer to the question of why God does this. God just says, I do it. So Habakkuk's sort of put in his place by God, right? God does not answer to Habakkuk, and Habakkuk is not owed an answer to these questions. Very similar to Job, right? Job sort of whines and complains and questions God. Not that I can really blame him. If everything that happened to Job happened to me, I would be whining and complaining too. But, and then at the end, Job is kind of put in his place, right? God does not answer to Job. It's very similar with Habakkuk. So even in these first 8 verses, we see that Habakkuk kind of is being corrected by God a little bit. Anyway, now we get the next, 5 verses 9 through 14. Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster. You give shameful counsel to your house, cutting off many peoples, and sin against your soul. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it. Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed, who establishes a city by iniquity. Behold, it is not of the Lord of hosts that the peoples labor to feed the fire, and nations weary themselves in vain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the seas. So, first question that I asked is, what is different about the second woe from the first woe? All right, so the first one, woe to him who increases what is not his. And the second woe, in verse 9, woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster. What are we noticing here that's a little bit different? So in the first woe, right, God is rebuking what? Stealing, extortion, essentially, yes. So that is an action, right? And then here, God is seeming to rebuke what? Well,
The people who want to do the same thing.
God's rebuking a mindset is what I was going with. Right, so this woe is a little bit more personal. It's not just a woe against Babylon's actions, but it's a woe against their attitudes. Woe to you, Babylon, for wickedly building your house and believing yourself above punishment. Right, so that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster. Right, so essentially, you're building your house so high you think that no one can come in and destroy you. And we've seen this before, right? We saw this with Nineveh. We saw this with Edom. We've seen this before. These cities, nations who essentially think themselves indestructible, like the Titanic. And so this is what Babylon is doing, right? It isn't just a woe against the evil ways in which Babylon was building its empire, but it was a woe against the evil ways in which Babylon thought of itself. Right, above punishment, above, what does it actually say? Above the power of disaster. Babylon built its empire on the destruction of other people. Right, and if you remember the story of Cain and Abel, right, it says, like your brother's blood calls out to me from the ground, and then Cain incurred God's punishment, right? So it talks about here, the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it, right? So the stones and the beams of the house which Babylon have killed, right, because Babylon sort of built its house upon the ruin of other nations. So these stones which Babylon killed and sort of built its power and fame upon will cry out, and Babylon will incur God's judgment as well. The NIV reads verse 11 as, "You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life," which might be an interpretive option, but I like it. It's pretty good. Yeah, basically you forfeited your own life. You're going to die. Babylon thought that by conquering these other nations and standing on top of these other nations proudly, that they were above punishment, right? Who can touch you when you're on the top of the geopolitical food chain?
God can.
God can, right? God's the only one that can, and so God does. God is not blind, God is not deaf, and he hears the cries of the oppressed at the hands of Babylon. And they will incur God's judgment. Trying to see what okay, here it is. Yes. I get all of this mixed up. Okay. Anyway, that makes all makes sense. Yes. Okay. So we look at verse 13, right? How do we see God at work in this verse? Right, so it's not merely just a description of what Babylon is doing, but we also kind of see what God is doing here as well.
Well, God is bringing about, in the final end of everything, he's bringing about his justice.
Yes, but be more specific. Don't roll your eyes at me, Lester.
You always
Well, all right, what does it say? What does it say? If you never know the answer to my question, just read the Bible. And I can't say you're wrong for just reading the Bible. Behold, is it not of the Lord of hosts that the peoples labor to feed the fire, and nations weary themselves in vain? So just answer the question. Is it not of the Lord of hosts that the people labor to feed the fire, nations weary themselves in vain? Yes, right, it is. It's this rhetorical question. It is of the Lord that Babylon labors to feed the fire, or in other words, they're trying to keep the kingdom afloat, right? They're trying to keep the fires brewing, but ultimately they labor in vain. God says that he is doing this. God will make the labors of Babylon bear no fruit. Right? Previously, Babylon was successful. And just about every metric, right? Economically successful, militarily successful, politically successful, all this sort of stuff. They had conquered nations, they were getting rich by using these corrupt methods. But soon, God will put a stop to all of this. And Babylon will labor to feed the fires and to keep the empire afloat, but it will all be in vain, right? So we see it's not just that God is sort of sitting passively by, letting this cycle of wickedness punishing wickedness go on, but that God is actually actively involved in this. And he is actively involved in judging these nations. So then we get to verse 14. So how is the hope of verse 14 contrasted with verses 12 and 13? Right, so you have a town that's built with bloodshed and iniquity, and then you have the whole earth being filled with God's glory. And that's like a very stark contrast between bloodshed and iniquity and God's glory.
what God does, He gets the glory for it.
Yes. Right. So, right now, right, is the earth full of God's glory?
In what respect?
Don't overthink the question, right?
Yes. The heavens declare the glory.
The heavens declare the glory of God. Yes. The earth is full of God's glory. This is not a trick question. Yes. This is obviously true, right? But then the Bible also indicates, as in right here, that there will be a time when the knowledge of God's glory will be throughout the whole earth, right? So in other words, there will be no more atheists.
Every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess.
Exactly, right? Everyone will know the glory of God. Well, obviously this hasn't happened yet. So we have this woe against Babylon, which may or may not be foretelling, depending on when you date this chapter, which doesn't really matter. But then we have this, which is definitely foretelling, right? This hope that one day the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of God's glory. So verse 14 is being contrasted with these previous two verses. But check this out, right? It asks this rhetorical question, and we sort of got into this, right? Is it not the Lord of hosts that the people labor to feed the fire? The nations weary themselves in vain. The answer, of course, being, yes, it is of the Lord. Because the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, right? Is it not of the Lord of hosts that the peoples labor to feed the fire, and nations weary themselves in vain? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water cover the sea. So it's sort of like because of XY sort of thing. All the evil that Babylon is doing that we read about in the previous two verses, and I guess even the previous 14 verses, God is actually using to bring about this time when the knowledge of God's glory will be known throughout the whole earth. And that's a pretty awesome thought. It's a very confusing thought. And I ran this by a couple people, and they acted like they had no clue what I was talking about. But the point is, the dumbest way I can put this is, it's all part of God's plan, right? Even the evil of this world and the wickedness of this world is all incorporated into God's plan to bring about this time when the knowledge of God's glory is everywhere, right? So that's sort of like, and I don't mean this to like demean you, but I mean, that's sort of like the way I could dumb it down the most.
It's a given.
It's a given what? That God wins? Yeah, exactly. God wins. That's the title of tonight's lesson, is God wins. Okay, so then we have the last section, verses 15 through 20, and I only asked one question from this. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to your bottle, even to make him drunk, that you may look on his nakedness. You are filled with shame instead of glory. You also drink, and be exposed as uncircumcised. The cup of the Lord's right hand will be turned against you, and utter shame will be on your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will cover you, and the plunder of beasts which made them afraid because of men's blood, the violence of the land and the city, and all who dwell in it. What profit is the image that its maker should carve it, the molded image a teacher of lies, that the maker of its mold should trust in it, to make mute idols? Woe to him who says to wood, awake, to silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So, one final question, and I guess there's no right or wrong answer to this necessarily, but what is significant about these closing verses, specifically 18 through 20? What is sort of significant? Given all that we've read tonight, what is significant about these two verses, or these three verses?
So he's addressing the pagan idols, that images that they worship, whatever, and all that, and God's just saying, you know, they don't breathe, they can't move, they can't do anything, and so it's.
So we talked about the first woe, right? Extortion, which is an act. Talked about the second woe, which was like a mindset or an attitude. And then this woe is sort of what?
Woe to the one who looks to all these other these things, these idols and stuff for their
Which is what sort of a problem?
idolatry.
Yes, but spiritual problem, right? So we have like the rebuke against like physical action. We have the rebuke against the mindset. Now we have the rebuke against ultimately like the spiritual idolatry. Yeah, idolatry, but you know, like the spiritual wickedness of the people. And God doesn't just come in and say, "Woe to the idolaters." He sort of asks a series of rhetorical questions, right? What profit is it to carve an image? What profit is it to trust in a molded image? What profit is there in molded idols? And then there comes the woe, right? Woe to him who says to wood, awake, and so forth, and all these other stuff. And what's significant about this, right, is God has just listed all these terrible, evil things which Babylon has done, right? You built your kingdom on bloodshed, and you took that which is not yours, and you think yourself above punishment, and you expose the nakedness of your neighbors, and all of this stuff. And now God is getting at the heart of the matter. Right? At the end of the day, Babylon rejected God, and that was really their problem. It was, you know, as a result of Babylon rejecting God, the entire empire of Babylon was plagued with evil, right? Everything that we see in the preceding verses is ultimately as a result of Babylon rejecting God and turning to idols. It's this sort of top-down problem that we saw in the last chapter when we were talking about Judah, right? King Jehoiakim and the priests, they were wicked, they rejected God, and as a result, all of Judah suffers, and there's injustice and wickedness throughout all of Judah. And now God is saying that Babylon, which also rejects God and is also wicked, will be used to punish Judah. And so it's all sort of full circle, right? Judah has this top-down problem. You know, the kings, the priests reject me, the people suffer. And so they're going to be punished by people, which also has this top-down problem. The kings, you know, they reject me. The priesthood that they do have is like a pagan priesthood, so like obviously they reject me. And they have this top-down problem, but they're going to be used to punish you for your top-down problem. So it's all sort of full circle. And verse 20 serves as a reminder, not for Babylon, but for Habakkuk. Right? And verse 20 says, "The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." Right? This isn't necessarily a reminder for Babylon, but one for Habakkuk. The Lord is in his holy temple. Right? What does this mean? Right? God is in control. God wins. Right? Like we said, God wins. This never-ending cycle of human wickedness begetting more human wickedness, you know, injustice, death, iniquity, all of this, in spite of all of this, God is in control. And that's as much of an answer as Habakkuk is going to get to his question of how can God use wickedness to punish wickedness. The closest thing to an answer that Habakkuk gets is, don't worry about it, I'm in control, basically. And so Habakkuk's kind of put in his place in this chapter. But God's in control of it all, right? And all of the world events which are playing out, God's ultimately the one who's in control. And it's the same today, right? we look around and we think, what is this world coming to? Well, as my dad always says, it's coming to an end, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So, anyway, I do not have application because the whole chapter is essentially application. Your application is essentially, don't worry about it, God's in control, and quit watching the news. All it does is stir people up into frenzied chaos.
Amen.
Do yourself a favor and watch Gunsmoke instead. Yeah. Okay, well, that's all I have. And I did not actually run you until 7 o'clock, so you're welcome. There you go.
Oh, thank you.
For every time.